Good afternoon. I'm Susan McGurgan. I'm an associate professor of pastoral theology at the Athenaeum of Ohio, Mount St. Mary's Seminary, and that's the diocesan seminary for the Archdiocese of Cincinnati. And I direct the lay formation program there, and I also teach evangelization, pastoral planning, and church history in the lay division. And I teach homiletics, too, to permanent deacons who are seeking their Sunday faculties. I'm glad to be here with you. I am going to be sitting, a couple of housekeeping items. I have a couple of handouts up here. One is just an outline of what I'm going to be talking about, and the other one is a group of quotes, some of which I'll be using in this presentation, some I'll be using in the paper, and some I won't be using at all. They were just inspirational to me as I was working on this. And then I have my card there if you want to get in touch with me later. I am going to be sitting while I give the presentation. I am recovering from what my family calls my unfortunate incident, in which I fractured my kneecap into many little pieces and then got put back together. So I am walking well, but standing is a bit of a sticky wicket sometimes, so I'm going to be sitting. Yeah, I don't want to think about it either. I guess I should have had one of my lovely assistants pass these out. So makes you get up and move, right? If you're one of the first 20 people, you get the pretty colored handouts that I made at home. I didn't know how many people would be attending the preaching conference, and so I made some while I was here in black and white. So if you don't get a colored one, you get more pages because I didn't make them duplicate. So if you have you may have taken too many. I may have to smack you if you don't put them back. Okay. All right. So this topic emerged for me about a decade ago during a kind of a difficult season in my own life. And so I began kind of to dance with the theological virtue of hope. And I guess to the outside observer, it probably looked more like a full-on body slam or mixed martial arts wrestling than a dance, but it was a dance nonetheless. And hope kind of became my great white whale that I was seeking. Sometimes I felt like Jacob, kind of wrestling with hope. Give me a blessing. If you're there, appear. And it did. And so through the years since, I've not only explored hope in a variety of lenses in my own life, but I've studied it academically and written papers and given talks on it. And I started looking at hope and gratitude. And then I began to work with hope and language and how language has the power to evoke hope. Hope and the wilderness or the desert experience. But in each of those explorations, the topic of memory kept emerging as part of the landscape. And so the more I looked at the science of memory and the role of memory in the history of the Jewish people and the role of memory in our Christian faith, it seemed that there was a lot of rich fodder there for preaching. So I want to offer this quote: remembering is an act of spiritual meaning, pushing us against the unknown. And I also want to offer for your reflection as we go through this, two icons of the preacher that I find interesting and meaningful and rather challenging. And one comes from Henry II in 1154, and the other one from Pope Francis in 2014. And Pope Francis charged the Korean bishops to be preachers as guardian of memory and guardians of hope. And I find that a really beautiful imagery to think about for your ministry as preacher. The other one comes from Henry in 1154, created a court position called the Remembrancer. And the role of the remembrancer was to put the court in remembrance of things to be recalled for benefit of the crown. And so I think if we image a different crown, and we think of the preacher as someone who is charged to put before the people the remembrance of things that are important to our King. Okay? So when I began to look at the theological virtue of hope, I found myself reflecting on the stories of two of my sets of great-grandparents who traveled west in wagons and settled on the prairie in northwest Kansas. And they had very difficult and challenging lives, but their faith held them in this web of connection and communion and hope. And so I got out the family albums and I began flipping through them, and I would see things like wedding invitations and birth announcements and funeral cards and ribbons from a homecoming mom. There were letters from my uncles during the war and photographs of birthday parties and of my brother catching crawdads in my grandpa's farm. And so these were these artifacts of my family, and they marked those seasons of mourning and celebration and of letting go and welcoming in and moving on. And within these memories of love and loss and connection, hope becomes real. And Pope Francis said, a Christian has two parameters, memory and hope. And we must evoke our memory so as not to lose the beautiful experience of that first love, which feeds our hope. These two parameters are the very frames in which we safeguard our salvation. So just as a scrapbook reminds us of who we are, recalling to mind the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus and recalling the history of our covenant with God gives us an identity as a person of faith. And so collectively, these memories shape our very existence. So the church can be described as a dynamic community of memory and faith. Okay. Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger said, the purpose of the church's year is to rehearse her great history, to rehearse this history of memories, to awaken in the heart's memory so that it can discern the star of hope. And all of the feasts in the church's calendar are essentially events of remembrance, and therefore they're events of hope. Okay, so the scriptures themselves invite us to remember. So we hear, remember Abraham, remember Jacob and Isaac, remember the Exodus, make a pile of stones, remember the Sabbath. And then we hear, come to the table, take and eat, remember me. So we're indeed a community of memory. And memory, we find the word memory 200 times in the Old Testament and 74 times in the New Testament. So it is a book of remembrance. The challenges we face in preaching today are significant, and not just preaching, but religious formation and catechesis and evangelization and outreach. Some of those were named by Father Mike, I thought very evocatively this morning. And they include these familiar litanies of a culture that looks skeptically on institutions, particularly religious institutions, the deepening social and political polarization, the increasing noise that we have. Father Mike called it bombast, which is such a great word, the bombast in our public life. Secular and religious leadership that has failed us and, frankly, continues to fail us in the present. We've got declining mass attendance, a rise in the number of people who identify themselves as unchurched. Cincinnati is a heavily Catholic town, and particularly on the west side. And I spoke to a deacon right before I left to come here, and he said at the last deanery meeting, one of our powerhouse west side deaneries reported that in the last 10 years, every parish experienced at least a 35% decline in membership, and some a 60%. And this is in a Catholic town with a very vibrant and strong Catholic institutional life. Okay. We have a lot more people who are unchurched, never churched, sharp decline in the celebration of the sacraments of initiation, baptism, and confirmation, weddings. People aren't getting married in church anymore. And so the drop of affiliation that we see very sharply in the youth and young adults is actually across the boards. So it actually is across the generations as well. But I think perhaps even more insidious than that is the unraveling of what we call our common network of beliefs and practices. So consciously or unconsciously, groups and communities make decisions and form a consensus about what's going to be remembered and what's going to be forgotten. And that becomes kind of part of our collective memory, part of our treasury, that we pass down. And the transmission of these memories requires repetition, significance, a sense of belonging on the part of the person transmitting and also the person receiving. And collective memories begin to fade when we no longer have that sense of belonging. So the urge to transmit declines, and then on the part of the recipient, there is less ability and willingness to receive. So when these memories are transmitted to a new generation, it's because that new generation finds them valuable or significant or important, okay? And many of our collective memories are now in disarray. They're fragmented, they're disconnected. Sometimes they're received in part, but perhaps skewed to where they become almost unrecognizable. Our collective memories no longer seem to speak clearly or convincingly. So as a result, there's been this growing erosion of that kind of meta-narrative that shaped church and society. Some theologians and sociologists think we may be at risk of seeing a collapse of our collective memories altogether. I think we see it if we see a decline in biblical literacy. I do a lot of lector training, and one of the things I say to the lectors is, you're the remnant, you're the faithful remnant of the people who are biblically literate, of the people who still engage in Scripture on a daily or weekly basis. We can no longer make the assumption that the people sitting at Mass, even every week, are literate in the language of Scripture and liturgy and worship, that they have received these collective memories and are able to transmit it. And this all endangers our spiritual health. It affects our ability to proclaim the gospel effectively. It affects our ability to evangelize and catechize. And it affects our ability to engage in the work of mission and justice. Okay? So it matters that we preach. It matters. It matters that we call people to remember God. It matters that we remember values, that we call people to remember their neighbor, remember the story. It matters that we preach. It matters that we call people to remember. And memory is more than nostalgia. I think we see a lot of nostalgia in the church today. And nostalgia is not memory. Nostalgia romanticizes things. It puts a veneer of this romantic gauze across memory. But it's more than that. It's more than recalling. It's an act of spiritual leadership. And I love that the theme of this is that spiritual leadership, the preacher as mystagogue and mystic, because preaching is an act of spiritual leadership. It's an act of pastoral care. It's an act of prophetic proclamation. It's an act of mystagogy. It's all that. And it is also an act of memory. It is also calling people to remember. And by doing that, we can make something vital and living in front of people again. So preachers are still that, you're that still small voice saying, wake up, remember who you are, remember who God is. And it doesn't really matter how wordsmithed your message is or how perfect it is. It matters that someone wakes up, okay? So what you do matters. In order for preaching to have a lasting impact on memory formation, the retrieval and support of memory, we need to understand how individual memory is formed, how it's stored, how it's retrieved, what we can do to help our people remember our message more effectively. And we need to understand what we mean by collective memory and how collective memory is sustained and transmitted, and the ways that you as a preacher, and particularly you who are pastors, can foster this in your community. You can help listeners enter into the remembering process and form them in ways to be people who remember well. And isn't that what we want? I mean, we don't want the messages that we preach to simply be, like smoke, and they disappear. So this is really a work in progress. I have really just started working on memory in the grand scheme of things very recently. But I think I'm going to offer some connections between memory studies and preaching, and hopefully present a few concrete ways that preaching can support memory formation and recall and support that collective memory. And it developed from those questions that I continue to ask about the theological virtue of hope and the ways that language, gratitude, the wilderness, and now memory can illuminate and evoke hope. That refrain, remember, is a thread that runs throughout Scripture. And it's impossible to read Scripture without bumping up against that connection. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about the science of memory, what is collective memory, and then we'll move to some practical ways. And I will leave time definitely for some discussion and your own insights. So memory refers to our ways to encode, store, and retrieve information. Memories are connections, not just spiritual or social, but biochemical. Our memories are biochemical connections, okay? Adult brains contain 100 billion cells. Newborn infants' brains contain 200 billion cells because their learning curve is so steep, okay? We have 5,000 synaptic connections with a possibility of 500 trillion potential connections. So our brain is truly a marvelous thing, okay? Memory is a vital part of what makes us human, and yet memory, how it functions, how it shapes us, how it can be damaged, how it can be strengthened, remains rather elusive, and it's kind of surprising when you start studying memory. We are still in our infancy, scientists are still in their infancy about learning about all the ways that memory functions, and there's a lot still to be discovered. And a lot that is debated, even among researchers. It remains one of the great mysteries in science today. And this research into brain cognition and functioning really began in the modern era in 1953, when surgery to hopefully repair a young man's overwhelming number of seizures that he had. It didn't go horribly awry, but there were unexpected consequences. And although the seizures lessened, he lost his ability to form short-term memory. So this kind of jump-started, they wanted to find answers to why this happened. And that was really the birth of the systematic research into modern brain studies. And so we've had advances in surgery and body mapping imagery that allows scientists to actually see the brain functioning in real time. And so they really are redefining, what we know about this. Without memory, and the flip side, without the ability to forget, we would face a constant, unending barrage of input and sensory impressions. We would be overwhelmed by input that we couldn't process, store, or retrieve. We couldn't understand it. We'd be cut adrift from our own history and experience, unable to turn the page, unable to reflect, unable to learn or recall, unable even to recognize our own face in the mirror. Elie Wiesel, in his Nobel lecture in 1986 said, "Without memory, our existence would be barren and opaque, like a prison cell in which no light penetrates, like a tomb which rejects the living." So the process of building memory is complex and nuanced, and I can't help but think of the scripture, "Truly we are fearfully and wonderfully made." There are multiple types of memory, and scientists are still discovering more types of memory: short-term, long-term, episodic, spatial, somatic, just to name a few. But each moment we absorb these vast amounts of sensory input, thoughts, and they are transcribed in the cortex and sent temporarily to the hippocampus, and that's a small region in the temporal lobe that processes short-term memory. Short-term memory is designed to decay, and that's how we were designed. If it didn't decay, again, we'd be overwhelmed by things. So it's limited in time and capacity. And unless something attracts attention in some way, unless something has a priority setting, it is simply going to decay and erode. We won't encode it into long-term memory. It's released usually within microseconds. But if we become aware of or attend to something in some conscious way, or if it forms a pattern or a connection with something that we have previously stored, then it can be transferred via these neurons and via these electrical chemical processes into long-term storage. So when it's transferred through synapses, and these are images of synapses, and they have actually recorded the sound of synapses firing. I mean, this stuff is amazing. It's like falling down a rabbit hole. Don't go on YouTube. You'll never come back, you know. But when it's transferred, the neurons send electrical impulses to each other, and then they transmit the data from the hippocampus to long-term storage areas that are located throughout the brain. Okay? Because our brains are so plastic and so subtle, these connections can change over time. And so circuits that are used frequently are strengthened, and circuits that we rarely use can erode, weaken, or even disappear altogether. So the more links that a brain can establish with existing neuron circuits, the more likely the material is to be saved into long-term storage. Okay? So we'll come back to that because that's a really important concept for preaching. We like to sometimes think of the brain as a library where things are just kind of stored off a shelf and you get them off. But it's not a library, and it's not a processor. It's not like a computer processor where you have a central processing unit. Memory is not a thing. It's a process. It's a complex action. Brain mapping of people who are actually recalling a specific memory shows activity in multiple parts of the brain, which indicates that most ordinary memories are stored in fragments in a variety of locations. And each memory fragment is stored in the region that initiated it, in these complex networks. And when we recall something, that memory then reassembles. Now, my colleague Deb, who works a lot with trauma, people who have engaged in significant trauma, she and I were talking about this the other night, and scientists seem to think that trauma memories of violent or traumatic experiences, are different, perhaps even different biochemically. So the memories that I'm talking about here are the ordinary memories of human life, sad, happy, neutral, but not those violent and traumatic memories, which may be a different animal altogether. But these fragments are broken down and then they're reassembled. So they're not archived as complete units. So every time we recall something, we are recalling it anew. It is becoming reassembled anew. So even a vivid and a very detailed memory is written and rewritten each time we recall it. So the act of remembering makes memories vulnerable to change, but it also makes them part of our present experience, which is also important for preaching. Okay? So memory is stored in these dispersed areas in the same pattern that created them and then reassembled. Okay? Once recalled, and the memory is restored in long-term storage, it's also restored in the context of today's situation, today's emotions, today's concerns. So memory is powerful, but it is also malleable, okay? It continuously adapts memories to our needs in the present. It's the way memory works. So memory is never simply about the past. There is always this element of dynamism and this intimate and fluid connection between the past, the present, and the future. So memory, like faith itself, transcends time. And there is a powerful eschatological element to memory, just as there is to faith. It's an active force. So memory is an active force that, emerged from past experiences, but impacts the present and then sends us on a trajectory to the future. So when Pope Francis talked to the Korean bishops and charged them to be guardians of memory and guardians of hope, he said, remembering and treasuring the graces of the past also means drawing from the spiritual resources to confront with vision and determination the hopes, the promise, the challenges of the future. So there is this fluid and vibrant connection between past memories, today's situation, and future action. And it's this bright line that runs not only through secular scientific research, but also through our theological and spiritual reflections, which I find a wonderful connection. So memory in many ways carries today's fingerprints on it. So in 1925, a French philosopher and sociologist wrote this groundbreaking work on the concept of collective memory. And it's sometimes referred to social memory, but it's that memory that theorizes that groups construct and sustain their own worldview by shaping and transmitting memories of the past. And they cultivate and curate and transmit these memories, okay? And social memory does a lot of things. It can establish boundaries. It can identify membership, who's in, who's out. We are this, we are not that. It can determine structures for leadership and governance, affirm core beliefs, create methods of decision-making, justify actions. Our collective memories help us justify the past, envision the future. They help us construct and maintain a worldview. So you can see that if a group starts to have an erosion or an unraveling of these collective memories, things can start to, the center can start to fall apart. It can start to fold, okay? Collective memory really creates a narrative of being. Now, some memory researchers and sociologists are skeptical about the whole idea of collective memory, but we are not those people because we're people of the book, and we know that we have a collective memory. And frankly, even the skeptics agree that even individual memory is a social construct because memory is constructed and encoded and recalled in this crucible of relationship and society. So in recent years, what we've seen is a sharp uptick in the study of collective memory because of all of its effect on promoting and maintaining political agendas and ideologies and social consciousness. So it's kind of a hot topic right now. For people of faith, of course, collective memory is a natural stance since we are people who remember. Okay. God's own being is one of memory. It's fundamental to the covenant. You think about the covenant with Noah, and God says to Noah, I will remember. I will place my sign in the sky. I will place this bow in the sky. So the story of Noah really offers us a radical insight into the nature of God, in that God is a being who remembers. So we remember God, but God remembers us. Okay? So collective memory is not a genetic inheritance. It's not a biological imperative. It's not like green eyes or curly hair. It's not automatically passed on. It's created and it's transmitted within a social group. And it contains the memories that the group decides are valuable and important. And they can reflect thought and action, belief, but collective memories also shape all of those things. So they're not passive. They also are dynamic, and they also shape what it is they reflect. So it's never simply factual knowledge that we're dealing with. Our collective memories are not just, understanding what the catechism teaches or understanding our history. It's rather an immersion into an experience that transcends time. There's one midrash on the Torah that kind of explains what this means, and it says, "It is therefore incumbent on every Jewish person, whatever the era, whatever the age, that he should consider as though he himself had personally gone forth from Egypt." So I remember that God called me from slavery in Egypt. And I personally was liberated from that slavery. Okay. We can see this in the book of Numbers. So when you read the book of Numbers, it's all about memory. The book of Numbers really reflects the collective memory of the Jewish people and of their time in Egypt and how those memories affected their journey through the wilderness. And they really shaped their story. So the authors of Numbers really shaped their story based on these memories to reinforce faithfulness and to warn about what happens when people forget, to illuminate how dangerous the world becomes when you forget the covenant. Okay. So in order for an event or a memory or a location or a person to enter our collective memory, it has to be transformed into a symbol or a sign or a teaching. And then it becomes really very ripe with meaning. So it has to be expressed, and it can be expressed through a lot of ways, including, the sacred texts that we have, the rites and the rituals, monuments, artwork, celebrations, narratives, feasts, all of those ways to fix that collective memory in our mind. And it's concretized that way, and then we express it. So each generation of Israel became, in effect, Israel by telling and retelling the stories, and by absorbing, and by living, and by transmitting that rich tapestry of collective memory that they shared. And each Christian is absorbed into the life of the church through the rites and the rituals, but then more than that, through living out the faith through our collective experiences and becoming part of this group. Okay? So it's not linear or fixed. It remains significant as long as it remains relevant to people. It's not a given. Our collective memories are not permanent. They remain part of our heritage as long as we treasure them and remember them and sustain them and transmit them. And even more than that, as long as they're received. So they're our inheritance, but they are not a permanent inheritance, okay? We have to make ongoing usage of them, okay? By default, collective memory also accepts that a lot is forgotten and passed over and even deliberately erased. And so forgetting for individuals and for societies is normal, and at times even welcome, even a blessing. But if we forget or fail to transmit too many memories, the group may cease to exist. So that tension between remembering and forgetting is always there, and they both come with a price. So remembering and forgetting, they both come with a price. Wiesel reminds us that failure to remember and transmit an experience such as the Holocaust, which he was writing about, is to betray it. Okay? So failure to transmit our collective memories as Catholics, as Christians, as people of the book and the table, is to betray that experience. Okay? We are not responsible for what happened in the past, but those of us living today are responsible for the ways in which we remember the past and the ways in which we transmit the past. Okay. So how can we as preachers help sustain and transmit these collective memories? And how can we help our people, our listeners, to become more effective in the ways that they form and retain the memories of the messages that we want to convey to them? Okay? Memory studies themselves suggest a couple of ways, and these include drawing on the tradition of mystagogical preaching, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The practitioners of mystagogical preaching from the 2nd to the 5th centuries seemed to understand instinctively that the methodologies that they were using in preaching were also methodologies that helped stick material in people's memories. Okay? And then memory studies themselves have taught us knowledge about how memory works and some of the biological criteria that the brain uses to prioritize and sort incoming data. Okay? So the brain has a triage system. Okay? It sorts, analyzes, and prioritizes data to determine what needs to be stored and what we can release immediately. So there are certain priority triggers for memory formation. Our brains are pattern-seeking organs, pattern-seeking machines, and our brains are constantly searching for connections and patterns that they can build up, that they can hook to existing patterns that they have already created. So memory forms when a lot of neurons fire. So if new input can be linked to previously stored memories, we have a better chance of retaining it. Okay? So if the input is random and the brain doesn't readily find a pattern or a link to previous information, the new material may not be retained. Sensory engagement is another priority. So sensory experiences typically involve multiple circuits. And anytime multiple circuits fire in the brain, we have a better probability of retaining the information. So different sensory inputs such as smell, taste, sight, touch, those are all processed and stored in different parts of the brain. When multiple circuits fire, there's a better probability. So if the input is multisensory, there's a higher probability of being retained in memory because more circuits are firing and more circuits make connections. Emotional intensity is also another priority. We are hardwired biologically to pay attention to input that triggers an emotional response in us. We are also designed to instinctively parallel the emotional landscape that we sense in other people. This is not a conscious effort on our part. This is instinctive and biological, and it probably stems from our survival instinct. So it's kind of our lizard brains at work. It's that instinctive thing back when we were hunters and gatherers and moving in a small tribe of people. Our very survival depended on our emotional connection with the 2 or 3 or 4 people around us. And so we are hardwired to respond to emotional input from someone else and to parallel that emotional input in ourselves. Personal benefit is another high priority. If we sense that there is a personal benefit or personal advantage or personal interest, our brains put it as a higher priority to be stored. And again, this is part of our survival instinct, There is also a primacy and a recency effect and a highlight effect that scientists have noted. There are a lot others, but we have limited time, and these are the ones that I think really work for preaching. So we need to preach across time, linking past, present, and future. So when you preach, you and the listeners become partners in a very powerful event. And preaching fosters participation, ongoing participation in the covenant. Preaching is not just about what's going on right now. It actually actualizes that which is remembered. So the homily brings together in this one moment the memory of Scripture, the past and present liturgical action, and the situations of the gathered people, and then our visions for the future. And preaching actually helps actualize that in the lives of the people. And these memories create expectations. So we remember God, and God remembers us. And the Jewish people remembered that they were slaves in Egypt, and they remembered that God redeemed them. And after the Exodus, when they gathered and they remembered suffering, they also remembered that they were liberated. And that memory of liberation liberated them in the present day. And we see this in the preaching during the Civil Rights Movement. The great preachers, Fred Shuttlesworth and Abernathy and Reverend Martin Luther King, they used that same power of actualizing memory in their preaching. And they preached about liberation. And they preached about the Exodus. And as their people were facing police dogs and water cannons, they preached, remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. And this conscious remembrance of God's liberating action in the past, and they were convinced of God's liberating action in the future, gave them freedom today. And it gave them the freedom to claim victory even as they still faced the pain of prejudice and the pain of prison walls and oppression. So what was drawn up from the past was not a series of facts to be contemplated at a distance, but rather it was situations in which you could be existentially put, you know? So the Passover meal, more than an enactment, more than a symbol, it brought that event directly into the lives of the people. We experience this at the Eucharistic table. Every time we experience this. But also in other sacramental moments, in prayer, we experience this, okay? So we preach across time. And there are some great moments which we can really draw the community's attention to this past, present, and future actualized in these one events. Holy Week and Advent are great times to call to mind how the past, the present, and the future are connected. Funeral homilies, another great time to do that. These are times when the readings and the season invite the church to be mindful of the fluidity of time and the fact that God's time is not our time. Okay? Funeral homilies invite the community to keep the story alive, to re-envision, to reimagine, this life of faith. And then these serve as counter memories to our own memories of brokenness or loss or pain. You can also illuminate this in ordinary times by remembering the times, calling the community's attention back to times when God remembered. When are the significant moments in your own community's history when God was faithful? When hope emerged from unexpected places, when mercy was extended, when the stranger was welcomed. Remind the listener that what God did before, God is doing now, and God will do again. And this realized eschatology is what you're preaching. So look for those moments and find those moments. So memory creates this dynamic connection, past, present, and future. We need to create space for the memories of others. So parishes are really subcultures that embrace and reflect a lot more than the creeds and the prayers and the structures. So at a deeper level, these subcultures are defined by symbols and signals and idioms and collective memories of heroes and struggles and triumphs. And every parish, even a parish that looks homogeneous on the surface, can actually encompass significant differences below the surface. So in order to connect, preachers really have to become aware. You have to become aware of your own social location and your own biases, to understand that your lens is not necessarily normative. And then you need to become what anthropologists come participant observers, or embedded reporters, if you like. I have a friend who's a farmer, one of the best preachers I know, and he grew up on a farm, and he likes the image of the itinerant farmer, whatever you call it. You need to learn and collect and understand and observe the stories and idioms of your own community, because I can guarantee you that most of them are different from your own. You have to foster a space of welcome for the memories of others, even if those memories are hard for you to understand. Okay? We have to embrace, in the Hebrew scriptures, the idea of hospitality is more than being nice. It's a biblical imperative of justice. And so we have to have that sense that this welcome is not simply being nice. It's a call to justice that God demands of us. Okay, so you need to surface those stories, and then you can start forming connections. You can start forming the connections with them as you preach. And remember, the brain is a pattern-seeking, organ. We constantly are seeking out patterns and connections. And so you can find those links. If they are emotional links, if you can articulate values, engagement with the senses, common experiences that people have, and then preach, inviting people to see those connections. And particularly if you do that over time, you will start to build that collective memory in the community. This process would really be enhanced if you would train the community in effective communications. We can talk until we're blue in the face about trying to help make preachers more effective, but until we make listeners better listeners, we're only dealing with half of the equation. So I really encourage all of you to work with the people in your community in small groups and give them the communication skills that they need to be effective listeners. Attentive listening, observation, the use of open-ended questions, feedback, all of these things will help your preaching be better, and it will help your listeners be better listeners. And it will also help them listen to the stories of each other, and it will foster those connections. And I guarantee that your landscape for preaching will become much more fertile. In addition, and I know this is starting to sound like a broken record in this conference, and I put this in my talk before I heard anyone else say it, but you need to expand the range of preaching voices in your community as well. You can remain well within the canons of preaching while making room for lay preachers, both men and women. If we believe that the only preaching that takes place and the only preaching that counts is the preaching that happens on Sunday in the pulpit, most people in the United States today will never hear the preached word. Okay? There are so many opportunities for preaching. The RCIA, the minor rites of the RCIA, youth gatherings, small faith groups, morning and evening prayer, missions, days of formation. If you have an open spirit to the embodied testimony of others, this will encourage the development of a shared collective memory in your community. And this process can help the memory kind of develop a third culture that embraces the richness of the many cultures that exist in our parishes today. There are also very difficult memories. And While I believe that personal memories can be powerful conduits of hope, not all memories awaken hope. Not all memories awaken goodness. Personal memories can be difficult, of a difficult childhood, a tragic loss. Some memories, given the right trigger, they come back like a stealth bomber. Collective memories also include some that haunt us, convict us, make us wish we had never awakened. We have a need to remember. We have a desire to forget, and we tend to live in the thin space between those two dynamics. So when personal memories wound, it helps us to know that our faith reminds us that we have access to memories beyond our own. We have access to memories that are larger than our own, more hope-filled than our own. And we're promised that we're not going to be left orphans. And in that promise, then we are connected with this communion of saints. And we have access to all of those memories, circuit by circuit, memory by memory. And when the collective memories wound, it helps to remember that our memories include both the official memories created and sustained by the structure of the community, but there are always other memories. There are always other memories that travel just a little bit beneath, just a little bit to the side, and they tell often a very different story. Collective memories tend to preserve the status quo, but the counter memories have the power to subvert authority and offer hope to the oppressed and a challenge to the oppressor when they're needed. Okay. So it's kind of like an internal prophet. These counter memories can remind us that the way things are today aren't necessarily the way things have to be. And within memory, there is the power to show us another time and another place, another view. So we struggle today in our church with memories of times when we have failed to protect the young and the vulnerable. And it would be very tempting to try to forget these memories. But the difficult memories that linger are essential, and we owe a debt of remembrance, no matter how painful, to those who've been wounded by our actions. And there is hope and healing in the knowledge that God was at work in the dark memories of the Jewish people as they struggled through the wilderness. And it reminds us that God is also at work in our difficult memories. Okay. So it's important not only to remember, but to remember rightly. If we fail to incorporate these difficult memories into our collective memory, we risk betraying those who we've hurt, like Elie Wiesel reminds us. We also risk alienating many of our youth and young adults who are watching us very closely to see how we handle and how we respond. So as guardian of memory, it's the task of the preacher to remind the community of the breadth and the depth of our memories, the debt that we owe other people to remember, and the power and the hope that emerges even from memories that we find difficult or painful. One of the things we need to do is preach a big idea. Our brains have almost unlimited capacity, 500 trillion potential connections. Okay? We are biologically wired to deal with complex patterns and intricate connections. Yet perhaps because I think homiletics professors constantly hammer it into our brains that we offer one theme, one idea, one image, contemporary preaching is often superficial. So the nuances of theology and scripture and moral decision-making are almost always glossed over, swept away, in a mistaken idea that this is being clear. But clarity and accessibility and focus does not equal shallowness. So our brains have a biological imperative to make complex connections, and we should invite listeners into a very rich, engaging, and big world. So our faith is deep, and it's multifaceted and nuanced, and so are our brains. So don't make that one focused homiletic statement shallow. Make it big. Make it challenging. You may not preach a great homily every week, but every week you should wrestle with a big idea. Preach from your own emotional core. Preaching, liturgy, and theater share a lot of common ground, and a lot of people don't like to hear that, but it's just true. Preaching the word is an embodied experience, and we bring the scripture and the liturgy to life. The text and the homily are both performed. We use our body, our voice, our gesture, and our imaginations to bring it to life. So these aren't private events. We open them out. They are opened out into the community. And we're never a neutral narrator. When we preach, we are always invested. We have a dog in the fight, you know? We are invested in the message. So we have to get in touch with the emotions of the text. And we have to make an honest connection from our own emotional core with that text. Where does it ebb and flow? Where is the high point? How do we feel about it? What do we know? So preaching from our emotional core doesn't mean we preach about ourselves, and it doesn't mean we preach about our emotions. It doesn't mean that we all go home and channel Jimmy Swaggart, because that would just be wrong in so many ways. But it does mean that we tap into our connections, okay? It heightens the possibility that your listeners are going to retain your message, because again, we are hardwired to respond to genuine emotion in another person and to parallel that emotion in our own lives, okay? We need to engage in signs and symbols. So we need to engage in the physical practices of faith. They're there for a reason. Our Catholic faith is a very sensual, bodily, engaged faith. We make signs of the cross. We kneel. We use incense and oil and water and light and fire. And these sensory and bodily practices of the faith, the sprinkling rites, the incense, the processions, the pilgrimage, all of these help to fix our collective memory in long-term storage. Muscle or body memory is so fundamental that it is often the last memory to leave, even when people are suffering from dementia and short and long-term memory has left. Body memory remains, muscle memory remains. And so we need to embrace that, Christmas, Holy Thursday, Good Friday, the veneration, the foot washing, the cross, the fire. All of these things have the power to fix in our memories, and we need to make use of them in our preaching, and we need to make use of them in our parish life. People are hungry for these things. So many of the young people who have left the church and then returned to the church are returning to Latin Rite churches, Latin Mass churches, pre-Vatican II churches. They're hungry for the expressions of our collective memory. Let's give it to them. And we need to preach mystagogically. The mystagogical preaching is a wonderful connection with memory, engaging with the senses, engaging with patterns, unpacking the rites that just happened. Mystagogical preaching is not a theological construct. It's taking the rites that we just experienced in and unpacking the images, unpacking the gestures and the language. And so this is all designed to fix in our memory. There's a primacy and a recency effect that scholars have noticed, and this talks about the first things and the last things. So first things, fresh things, the first item on a list. It has the impact of being more easily retained. So this accounts for newspaper headlines, magazine headlines, the memorability that we have of opening lines of plays and movies or novels. Our brains are wired to remember first things. So what your homiletics professor said about introductions and conclusions, it's all true. They're really important. the first things and the last things. So what you need to make sure is that your introductions take you where you want to go, that they connect attention. You don't want to make your introduction be an announcement. Welcome to the 10 o'clock Mass here. Pick up your mums at the back of church. That's what people are going to remember. So let your preaching be preaching. Let your announcements be announcements. With the primacy effect, the first things you say are important. So don't let it be in the first reading we see. Begin to preach and preach that big idea. With the recency effect, it means the last things you say have a high priority of being fixed in our memories. This is heightened if the last thing you say connects in a tangential way with what came before, if it's not overlaid with new material, and if you don't go in a new direction. So make good use of the liturgical pause after you preach. Don't let the prayers step on the toes of the homily. Make sure that you give people chance to reflect on what the last thing you said, because there's a good chance that they will remember it. So make it worth remembering. And then practice repetition over time. These song lyrics from Cyndi Lauper actually could be a homily. If you're lost, you can look and you will find me time after time. If you fall, I will catch you. I will be waiting time after time, time after time. So don't be afraid to repeat yourself. Use repetition over time. Our brains are constructed to remember best what we have remembered before, okay? Even if tangentially, because what our brains are trying to do is access patterns. So take the time to remind listeners of overarching themes. Take the time to remind listeners, if what you're preaching this week connects with what you preached last week, remind the listeners of that connection. Remind them of recurring themes in the homily or in the readings, in the liturgical prayers. Point out those connections and those shared experiences or those themes. Don't hesitate to connect one homily to the next or one lectionary reading to the next, even across weeks. Take the time to schedule long-term as well as proximate homily planning. My Protestant friends schedule vast amounts of time for homily preparation, and my Catholic friends schedule very little. Do not apologize to the people or your staff for how much time you take to prepare your homilies. Block it on your calendar and make it sacrosanct. Make it your sacred time, because it will pay off for the people. But don't just plan week to week. Take some time to look, lectionary groupings out or a season out, and see what overarching themes occur. See what characters appear and reappear. Make some connections in your homilies over time. And the more links and patterns you can establish, the more we are going to remember what you say. And if you're introducing something new, always preach from the familiar to the new. So think of our brains like, it's like our memories are like Velcro, and Velcro works because it has all of those little connectors. It doesn't just have one or two, it has all of those little connectors. And so out of familiar patterns, we create new ones. So if you want to introduce something new to your community, we will have a better chance of retaining it if you link it to something that we have already experienced or we already know or we already believe or understand, because our brain is designed to work from the familiar to the new. I was in one parish one time where the music director did a different Gloria every week. And at the end of 4 or 5 weeks, we were all just so, we were in disarray. Nobody could even function anymore. It was almost like you dreaded the organ sound, So we're just not designed to constantly have a bombardment of new things. And our modern culture, it's one reason I think why people are so searching for spiritual truths, is because we are bombarded with things that are new. We are bombarded with new ideas, new situations all the time, and our brains are designed to function from the familiar to the new. So when you remind listeners, Remind listeners that we're held in this web of connections, that we are held in these texts and in this history and in these prayers, and then new things are more easily retained. And then I want to just remind you to foster the collective memory. I think it can be, this breakdown of our collective memory can be more corrosive than a failure of our catechesis. Each generation models the faith for the other. And we need to be encouraging our families when we tell our parents that they are the first and best teachers of their children. This doesn't mean they have to swallow the catechism, Encourage them to share their memories. Share the memories of the child's baptism. Share their memories of their own wedding. Share their memories of their grandparents' faith. This is what we mean by being the teachers of the faith. Experience teaches us that it's only in community that we can proclaim liberation. It's only in community that we can say that the stone has been rolled away. And it's only in community that these powerful stories come to life. And I think one of the tragedies that's emerging from the erosion of our collective memory is that so many people now live without this hope. There are so many people in our neighborhoods, in our schools, and in our grocery stores that live without hope. And I cannot imagine anything more tragic. But the good news is that people are thirsty, and they long for preaching that opens up possibilities. They long for preaching that opens up hope. And they want to hear a living word from a preacher who knows where to find the water. That's what we're looking for. So remember that you were slaves in Egypt. Remember that the Lord God redeemed you and delivered you. And, in that memory, we remember God, and God remembers us. And, it matters that you preach. It matters. So thank you. And any questions or comments that you have?